William Gray of Pennsylvania and Les Aspin of Wisconsin, Democratic Senator Lloyd Bentsen of Texas, syndicated columnist Mark Shields, and Jim Jones, the chairman-elect of the American Stock Exchange.
Good morning. If you could just take your seats, we have an informative, insightful, and riveting speaker to kick things off this morning.
You better leave, my man.
In trying to explain American history, political history, to those not familiar with it, the state of Wisconsin, which is represented in the Congress by, among others, our next speaker, was really the first state of the Northwest to be settled. It was unlike the states of the Middle Atlantic and the Eastern Seaboard. It was a state that was settled by Scandinavians and Germans rather than the English, Scots, and Scotch-Irish who had settled most of the eastern United States. That tradition led to a rather unique maverick brand of politics, or contributed to it certainly, sort of a German socialist belief in free education, free soil, and a Scandinavian commitment to clean government. And the progressive movement, of course, in this country had its roots in that rich political soil of Wisconsin. Consistent with that tradition, our speaker today is an established maverick, a man of considerable academic achievement, an honors graduate of Yale, graduate work at the master's degree from Oxford and a PhD from MIT. He was one of the whiz kids in the Pentagon. He was a staff member of President Kennedy's Council of Economic Advisors, elected to the Congress in 1970. Since 1971, Les Aspin has been a member of the Armed Services Committee of the House. In 1985, over several senior members, he was elected as chairman of that committee. And perhaps the best description of his tenure as chairman is contributed by the New York Times. It said, Les Aspin has turned the Armed Services Committee from a Pentagon rubber stamp into a force for constructive change. We'll find out now what constructive changes Les Aspin has in mind. The chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Les Aspin.
Thank you, Mark Shields. Joe historian over here. Let me talk a little bit, and appreciate the opportunity to come over here and talk to you a little bit this morning. Talk a little bit about a report on where the Bush administration is going in regards to the relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. And let me start back with the last election. During the last election, the debate was not over what should we do with perestroika, glasnost, and Mikhail Gorbachev. During the last election, the debate seemed to revolve around the question of what caused Mikhail Gorbachev to come along, perestroika to come along, and glasnost to come along. It's a typical of elections in this country that we don't debate the future. What we do is we debate the past. And what we were doing was debating what happened and how the changes in the Soviet Union came about. The Republicans during the last election were arguing that, in fact, the changes came about were due to the Reagan foreign policy. The policy of building up our defenses, of negotiating from strength, of not just talking to the Soviets about arms control, but insisting on talking about regional issues and human rights, and the support for the freedom fighters. The whole Reagan foreign policy, it was argued by Republicans during the last presidential election, were responsible for forcing the Soviets into the kinds of radical changes that we have seen taking place. The Democrats, on the other hand, argued this had nothing to do with it, that in fact the Reagan foreign policy was irrelevant, that in fact what brought the changes in the Soviet Union was that the economy in the Soviet Union was a basket case, that the process had just run into a dead end, and it was the combination of a lousy economy coupled with a new generation of leaders as represented by Mr. Gorbachev. That's what caused the changes to happen in the Soviet Union. Anyway, that was the debate. That was the debate in the last election. So having not taken the debate about what you do about the changes taking place in the Soviet Union, having not debated that when you thought we ought to debate it, which is during the presidential election, we now come into the new administration with Mr. Bush as president, and the debate takes place now as to what we should do about the changes taking place in the Soviet Union. As I saw it, beginning with the Bush administration's taking office in January, there seemed to be at the time about four different schools of thought about how the United States should respond to the changes in the Soviet Union. Starting over on the right hand was the view that if Reagan foreign policy had produced perestroika, more Reagan foreign policy will produce more perestroika. It was a view that we've got them on the run, turn up the heat, pour on the coals. It was a view that if you've got the Soviets moving in response to a foreign policy, increase what you're doing, increase the defense budget, increase the aid to the freedom fighters. That's at the right-hand side of the spectrum. Over on the left-hand side of the spectrum was a view that there really wasn't much articulated in the United States, in the political arena in the United States, but had some credence in Europe, which was the view that Gorbachev has already done it. That Gorbachev has in fact made the fundamental changes, that Gorbachev is for real, that what we need to do is to accept that, and we have to match new thinking in the Soviet Union with new thinking in the United States and in the West. Match new thinking in the Warsaw Pact with new thinking in NATO. That is the view over on the left. Now, between those two extremes were two other views of the world and the proper administration, what the administration ought to do. And they were the kind of middle grounds. On the one, slightly to the right of center, was what might be called the Stand Pat school. On the other hand, just slightly left of center, is what might be called the Seize the Opportunity school. And essentially the Stand Pat school argued that really what we ought to do is we ought to try and figure out what's going on in the Soviet Union, but be very, very cautious. It's essentially a reactive policy. Wait, see what's going on in the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, and fashion our policy based upon what we see. Don't take words as evidence of things. Wait until you see some deeds. Essentially, it's a rather skeptical view of what's going on, a view that we don't know whether, in fact, this thing's going to succeed or fail, a view that we can't influence it much on whether it's going to succeed or fail. So better keep your powder dry, wait and see, and if they come up with something worthwhile, if Gorbachev comes up with some ideas that are worthwhile in the arms control area, take him up on it. If he comes up with something that seems like nonsense, ignore it, or don't take him up on it. It's essentially a kind of a stand-pat view of the world. At the other side is the kind of what might be called the Seize the Opportunity school, which is that our grandchildren and our children and grandchildren will not forgive us if we don't take advantage of the opportunity presented by Mr. Gorbachev and the changes that are going on. It is much more of an active policy than a reactive policy. It calls upon the West and the United States to seize the opportunity, to propose things, to get out in front, to have some ideas, to push some agenda, to take advantage of Mr. Gorbachev's existence in office and push an arms control agenda, regional issues agenda, an economic agenda. In other words, it's much more engaging, it's much more active. Arnie Horlick said that these two schools of thought, I was presenting this at a conference, and Arnold Horlick said the way you characterize these two schools of thought is one is don't rock the boat, and the other is don't miss the boat school of thought on how we ought to address the Soviets. Well, basically, of course, the debate soon settled down to the two debates, to the two positions in the middle. And this is the debate that still goes on in the United States. Do you actually have a stand-pat policy, or do you have a policy of seize the opportunity? And what I've seen now, looking back over the 10 months, is it, that the Reagan administration has been in office, the Bush administration has been in office, is the question of how they sort themselves out between these two polar schools, the seize the opportunity and the stand pat school. They started out, and I would detect essentially about maybe 3 or 4 different phases that we've gone through. Phase number 1, they started out very much in the stand pat mode. The comments of the administration appointed officials as they were being questioned during their confirmation hearings was very much the kind of tone, was very much of a stand pat school tone. And I would contend that actually the Bush administration came into office with a view of the world that was that was kind of a reaction against what they perceived to be the kind of the rose-colored glasses view of the world of the outgoing Reagan administration. There was a feeling in the Bush administration that the Reagan crowd had been a little too gaga over Gorbachev, that there'd been a lot of kind of foolishness at Reykjavik in arms control and getting rid of nuclear weapons, that there'd been a lot, too much said about Gorbachev that indicated a very positive feeling. So there's kind of a reaction against that. The first period of the Bush administration, and I take the first period to be when they took office in January through April, was marked by a period of extreme skepticism. And in fact, a little harder line towards the Soviets than the outgoing Reagan administration. Baker kind of drew the line in the dust between him and Baker, and him and Schultz, his predecessor, by saying that he would not lift sanctions if the Soviets just withdrew from Afghanistan, that in fact he was going to use it to argue for more concessions. It was a move early on to put the START agreement on the back burner, whereas the Reagan administration had it on the front burner. And they were going to sit back and they were going to have a whole policy review before they moved. The policy review actually came out, and the classic phrase out of the policy review was status quo plus, that we're going to continue to engage the Soviets on the traditional issues, which are arms control, human rights, regional issues, bilateral issues, but the plus came by adding another group of issues, drugs, terrorism, and the environment. Status quo plus was the formation of the policy. Very much of a status quo, much more emphasis on status quo than on the plus. Then comes the month of May. The month of May, I think, could be characterized as a period of enormous confusion. So the second phase is a period of confusion in the Bush administration, where you had, on the one hand, Jim Baker kind of trying to explain status quo plus in his speeches. He talked about the uneasy coexistence in the Soviet Union between new thinking and old habits. He said we would press forward with our agenda to test the implications of the Soviet new thinking again and again, and to challenge the Soviets to see if they will fill out these slogans, their slogans, with context. Meanwhile, George Bush was making 3 speeches around the country. He was talking about moving beyond containment and integrating the Soviet Union into the community of nations. But then Dick Cheney was quoted on a very highly quoted television interview in which he predicted that Gorbachev would ultimately fall and he would be replaced by somebody much more hostile to the West. And of course, during this same month, this whole month period, Marlon Fitzwater was quoted with his famous quote, calling Gorbachev a drugstore cowboy. Enormous confusion during this period. 1 month, lots of different voices coming out of the same administration. Then we went into phase 3, which is the summer, right, which I would take then from the end of May right up until the recent Wyoming summit Wyoming meeting between Baker and Mr. Baker and Mr. Shevardnadze. The period started with Bush's high point, I think, was his speech to the NATO at the end of May, in which he proposed that the CFE talks be expanded to include personnel and aircraft. And it was basically a new approach and some new ideas, a very, very successful meeting, a successful foreign policy summit, and a successful start. Since then, what we've seen is these enormous changes that have been going on in Eastern Europe. The Polish elections, the emergence of a solidarity government, reformers seizing control of the Hungarian Communist Party, which is now the Hungarian Socialist Workers' Party. You see workers' strike and continued ethnic turmoil in the Soviet Union, the exodus of East Germans through Hungary, the demonstrations in East Germany, enormous changes that were going on during that period. Enter into period number 4, which is essentially where Baker has emerged from a stand-pat person to a seize-the-opportunity person. And period 4 begins with the Wyoming ministerial meeting, in which there was some essentially beginnings of some putting the START agreement back up on the up higher on the agenda, pushing it higher in terms of acknowledging that now was higher priority on the agenda, and was followed by 2 very amazing Baker speeches in the last couple of this month. One was on October 16th and the other on October 25th, in which Jim Baker was saying things. He gave speeches that actually could have been drafted by the administration's critics. In it, Baker says that perestroika is clearly in our interest because it produces a kinder, gentler Soviet Union that will work cooperatively with us. He says we can seize the opportunity offered by Gorbachev by seeking points of mutual advantage. He says we should act quickly while he is still around. He says that arms control agreements are a top priority because they lock in changes and make them harder to reverse. And he said that the goal is to create a more stable, open, broader, and less reversible strategic relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. I mean, these are the kind of speeches that the Bush administration's critics could have written. It's an amazing transformation. What we have seen over the 10 months is the transformation of Jim Baker from the stand-pat school to the seize the opportunity school. 2 questions, or 3 or 4 questions remain. Question number 1 is, does this extend beyond Jim Baker? Question number 2 is, does it extend beyond words to deeds? Question number 1, does it extend beyond Jim Baker? Not at all clear. Clearly, there is not. It's not clear that Jim Baker is beyond what he's been saying. At the same time that Jim Baker was giving these speeches, Vice President Quayle was giving a speech in San Francisco that sounded very much like the old line, sounded like, in fact, the old Jim Baker speeches. We've had recent story about how Bob Gates wanted to give a speech, and Mr. Baker put the squash on it because the Bob Gates speech sounded like the early Bush administration, did not sound like Jim Baker, late Jim Baker speeches. So it's not clear that it goes beyond. I would say that looking back over the 10 months, there has been enormous change in Jim Baker, from stand pat to seize the opportunity. There has been some change in George Bush. There has been, as far as I can tell, no change in Bob Gates and Dick Cheney, for example. So it's not at all clear whether Jim Baker is going to prevail in this. The second point is, does it extend beyond words to deeds? Again, not clear. The 2 deeds that the administration has taken over these 10 months that might be termed seize the opportunity were both cases where the administration was pushed into it by its critics. The first was the Memorial Day weekend NATO summit, where George Bush made what could be easily described as a seize the opportunity kind of proposal on the CFE talks at the NATO summit, to include aircraft, to include manpower, a much more far-reaching position. Clearly a seize the opportunity position, but clearly pushed into it by a lot of criticism all spring in this country that he was not moving fast enough, was too timid, etc. The second seize the opportunity thing to come out of this administration over 10 months has in fact also something they were pushed into it, and that is the increase in aid to Poland and the Eastern European front. The administration started out with the paltry $115 or $116 million when Lech Walesa was looking for about $10 billion last July. Gradually, the changes both in Poland and in the composition of the country here, the political climate here, has pushed the administration into offering a bigger package. And I would guess that at the end of that, that package is going to look pretty decent. And it's going to look pretty decent, especially in connection with the aid that's going to be provided by our NATO allies. The total package, financial package to Poland will be, I think, looks like it's shaping up to be a pretty decent package. A seize the opportunity initiative, to be sure, but clearly one in which the Bush administration was pushed rather than initiated. So does it extend beyond words? Not at all clear. The two cases where you said that you could say that the Bush administration has seized the opportunity were both cases in which they were pushed into it rather than jumped into it willingly. Final point. The Bush administration still has not conquered the vision thing. There still is no vision about where they want to go and where they think the world ought to be in a new era. What NATO ought to look like, what the Warsaw Pact ought to look like, what our military forces ought to look like, what the international relations ought to look like, what the economic exchanges ought to look like. There is no hint that there is a vision out there that the Bush administration is operating from. To be fair, it's very, very difficult to do because the situation on the ground is changing so dramatically and it's changing so quickly that in fact it's probably it is, no doubt, very, very difficult to come up with some kind of a vision because the thing that you're dealing with on the other side keeps changing so very, very much. And secondly, to be fair, as long as it looks like progress is taking place, the lack of a vision is probably not going to hurt them very much. As long as it looks like progress is being made on arms control, as long as it looks like things in Europe or Eastern Europe are beginning to develop, it's probably the fact that the Bush administration hasn't got a vision is probably going to hurt. It's probably not going to hurt them. It's as if something goes wrong in all of this, that they will be blamed for not having a vision. If a U-turn should come in the Soviet Union or a crackdown in Eastern Europe, just things are going too far and they just can't stand it. And if things happen, or if Gorbachev is bounced out of office, and then the claim will be we did not take advantage of Gorbachev while he was there, and then the fact that Bush did not have a vision, did not have a plan, did not say here's where we want to go and here's the steps where we want to get there. We're being cautious to protect ourselves against something going wrong, and sort of we want to protect ourselves, but at the same time seize the opportunity which is there. The fact that there is no vision will hurt, I think, only if the thing goes the other way in Eastern Europe, Gorbachev is thrown out in the Soviet Union, or something like that happens. Anyway, that's a report card. That's basically where the Bush administration is at this point, and I thank you all very much for letting me come speak to you today.
We take a couple of questions? Sure.
How much time we got?
We got 5 minutes. Sure. You can see from his academic background that Professor Aspen can be a tough grader. Are there any questions about defense, America's reaction to this warming in the world, this global warming and the international relations? Yes.
What do you see the level of defense spending being over the next 4 years, and do you see any major changes in programs that are currently underway?
Now the question is, what do we see as the level of defense spending over the next few years?
4 years.
4 years, and what was the changes in the programs that are now underway?
Yeah, do you see any major
Yeah.
currently underway, or any new starts?
I think that the most interesting question that faces us now is this business of how do you devise defense budgets in this period of change and uncertainty in the Soviet Union. There's big changes going on in the Soviet Union and in the Warsaw Pact. There's also enormous amount of uncertainty. How do you fashion defense budgets along those lines? My guess is that from political pressure only, defense budgets are going to come down. And are come down a lot more dramatically than they have been coming down, which is about 1-2% decline, real decline in defense spending over the last 4 or 5 years. I mean, I think that historians may look back and see this last year, the year that we're still working on, the FY90 defense budget, as the last defense budget that was really unaffected by what's going on in the Soviet Union and Gorbachev. By next spring, I would guess what's going on in the Soviet Union and Gorbachev will have a big, big impact on the level of defense spending, and it's going to be down. Then the question is, how do you devise a defense budget given the changes that are going on and the uncertainty? And it is very tough. And we're just beginning to see the bits of the debate. Do you, for example, if you have to cut defense spending, you see some changes in the Soviet Union, you don't know whether those are permanent, whether it's going to reverse. Do you, for example, cut the size of the forces and keep the readiness of each of the units up? Or do you keep the same number of forces and bring down the readiness of the units? You can make arguments either way. Do you, for example, try and say, well, we're going to continue to modernize the forces by buying the generation of equipment that we're buying, the Bradleys, the M1s, but we are going to cut back on the R&D for the future systems because if the Soviets look like less of a threat, the R&D really was always to maintain the qualitative edge of the U.S. forces, so we can now afford to cut back on the R&D? Or do you say the reverse? That in fact what we're going to do is continue to fund the R&D and look to the next generation, but what we're going to cut back is the modernization of the current forces. I think that we have not yet begun to see the debate that's going to take place on this. Dick Cheney came into office and actually proposed terminating several programs, as you know, the F-14s, the V-22, AHIP, Apache, F-15Es. I think that he did it essentially on kind of green eyeshade cost-benefit calculations without any sort of plan about how this fits in against what's going on in the Soviet Union. Not surprising he had to produce a budget within a month after taking office. But I would think that, and I supported him on those because I thought that at least he was doing some of the right things. If the defense budget's going to go down, you can't continue to produce all these lines of equipment. Something's got to be terminated. So I supported him, even though I didn't necessarily agree with all of his choices, but because he was actually moving in the right direction. It's going to be a much tougher test next year, is the question about why are you terminating this program? Why are we not starting this program? What's the rationale? How does it fit into what's going on, our threats, the changing threat, the uncertainty in the international world? In terms of rhetoric, Cheney seems to be saying that the changes in the Soviet Union have not yet been proven, and therefore we can't let our guard down. And he's arguing, in effect, for continued high defense budgets. My guess is he isn't going to get them. And then the question is, if you don't get the high defense budgets, what is your philosophy of how to cut them and how to cut back? It's going to be a very, very interesting debate. And of course, it's not going to be just next year, but if the Soviet Union continues on this path, it's going to be a debate that's going to be with us for a while. Other questions? Yes, sir. Last one.
Senator Nunn described President Gorbachev as a political genius. That genius appears quite frequently on European television news programs at very important parts of the day in terms of viewing numbers. By contrast, the American reaction seems rather lame. Do you feel that the change in approach that we're now seeing from the administration is a response to that appearance of lameness?
It's got to be at least partly due to that. I mean, I don't, who knows, motives are hard always to divine, but it's got to be at least in part. I think that the administration recognized fairly early in this year, its first year in office, that it had a PR problem. So even back to the days when they were in a stand-pat mode, as far as policy is concerned, they understood that they had a PR problem because Gorbachev was all over the world throwing off suggestions right, left about this and that, having to do with arms control, unilateral cuts, lots and lots of ideas. But what I've seen lately is, I think, goes beyond the recognition that there's a PR problem to the recognition that there really is an opportunity. And I think that Baker's meetings with Shevardnadze, not so much the formal meetings as maybe the informal meetings, did in fact make some changes in his view of the world. But I think, as I said in the talk, I'm not sure that his view is going to predominate in this administration, and I'm not convinced that his view will be able to go beyond words to deeds. What have they got to do? I mean, it seems to me that there are two things that they've actually moved on, were the CFE talks over Memorial Day and the aid to Poland. We'll see whether it goes beyond that. But it actually, to win the PR war, you got to win the substantive war. You got to have some ideas. You got to be willing to engage. So the first step is to admit that we're living in a period of seize the opportunity, and then come up with a bunch of plans that seize the opportunity, and the PR will fall from it. I mean, if you're coming up with interesting ideas and good ideas, you'll get the PR credit that you deserve from having it.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Really.
Okay, thank you all.
Thank you very much, Chairman Aspin. During the campaign of 1988, President George Bush, then candidate George Bush, established his independence from his predecessor and political sponsor Ronald Reagan on a number of issues. Certainly in the front rank of those issues was the environment, whereas the Reagan administration had in private dismissed those concerned with the environment and environmental problems as birds and bunny people. George Bush himself established during that campaign his own commitment to an active and energetic government role in solving the problems of our environment. As earnest proof of Mr. Bush's expressed ambition to be the environmental president, he nominated, and the Senate unanimously confirmed, William Kane Riley as administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. Since 1973, Mr. Riley had been president of the World Wildlife Fund U.S. and then of the Conservation Foundation. He is an extensive author and lecturer on environmental subjects, a confirmed environmentalist himself, an alumnus of Yale. Mr. Riley holds a master's degree in urban planning from Columbia and a law degree from Harvard. He served as a U.S. Army captain in 1966-67, the Environmental Protection Administrator of the United States, William Kane Riley. No. Mr. Riley is not here. Well, we have introduced Mr. Riley, and if he does show up, we know exactly who he is. Was there, I'm sorry, Pat, is there, no, he's not on the premises? He isn't, okay. But we are, and let me return to my own notes. And he is, we know he is, he just called from his car. Okay. He just called from his car, is undoubtedly a solar-powered phone, and he is stuck in traffic, which is an absolutely plausible excuse in Washington, and we'll be along. One question, Jim, did you go ahead? One question that recurs, and after both the chairman of the Armed Services Committee of the Senate, Sam Nunn, and the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Les Aspin, spoke, is sort of an emerging and changing definition of national security. For 40 years, we have been locked in this bipolar struggle with the Soviets, and containment has been the overriding concern. And the economic component and a new definition of American national security, what does standing up for America, how will it translate into the American political world, I think is a very real question, and for which there is no answer, but I'll happily turn it over to Chairman Jones, who I know has some insightful ideas on that question and other subjects. Jim Jones.
No, I don't, not going to respond to your question, Mark, but while we were outside and while we're waiting for Mr. Riley to arrive, the question was asked by John Dingell as he left to raise with you this whole question of program trading. And while we'll not do a scientific poll, I would be very interested and would like to hear your comments to pass on possibly to Chairman Dingell in advance of their writing legislation, your views as to program trading, your views as to whether it is makes you more or less comfortable to invest in this market, and if changes should be made, how they should be made, and how the government might approach it. So if you don't mind, Mark, we'll interrupt the program while we're waiting on Mr. Riley and throw it open for some comments, and I think particularly from those of you from other countries who look at this market as one of an investment opportunity. Would anybody care to, first of all, make some comments? Yes, sir.
My concern is simply that following October '87, we had the same expressions mentioned as to, and we had investigations and committees and goodness knows what looking into it, and then it all just seemed to go away, and now yet again we've had this thing come to the surface. I would really like to know if there's going to be a follow-through to all of this.
Well, that was a question that we heard a concern after the '87 market crash, and then it sort of went away, and business as usual was resumed in program trading, and now we're hearing a new concern, will there be any follow-through on this? I can give a personal view, as I think the follow-through that's being dictated by the marketplace is going to have a more permanent and lasting effect this time. The big question, as you heard from John Dingell this morning, whether that is sufficient to the regulators and to the policymakers in Congress to make them want to postpone again any legislation. And I'm not sure the answer to that question. But I'm more interested in trying to answer that question is to get a response from those of you who will invest in this market as to whether you would indeed continue to invest if the government did nothing, or whether you would encourage our government to take some restrictive actions on program trading. And if so, how would you approach it? Anybody want to, back here, yes sir.
Just two observations. Last week in Europe, we the brokers have been under fire. Two observations which have been said by some of our clients, which were, first of all, the brokers would have to decide if they are brokers or if they deal for their own account against their customers. So that's the first one. And another observation which I found quite interesting for my client was to say, basically, if this continues, we'll have to put a risk discount on the United States as a market compared to the other markets. These were two comments which I found personally very fair and which shows how bad the situation went with this in-house trading program. I'm talking about the in-house trading program because you have programs also which are done for customers' accounts as a hedge, but the in-house trading programs on which there was a lot of publicity gave a very bad mark to the United States markets.
Thank you very much. Other comments? Yes, sir.
I think it was particularly relevant when it was said that the public needs to have confidence in the marketplace, and I personally think that while one certainly can't avoid large gyrations in the market, and none of us actually know precisely how they occur, whatever that can be done to give public confidence to the marketplace must be done, I'm sure, and that confidence, I think, is eroding quite rapidly at the present time.
Any other comments? Yes, sir.
I think trust, faith is the most important thing, and Congressman Dingell expressed it clearly that we have to establish the confidence in investments, and investments take place over the long run to really make money, and all the short-term volatility is only causing the investors to shy away. And it's like winning a battle but losing the war. And therefore I think one should be pretty clearly and deeply looking into the matters to find some changes, since it really doesn't help in the long run.
Okay. Governmental. You're saying?
I mean, there are gentlemen's agreements with the SEC possible, and I mean, it depends on the market participants how they want to go about, and if they need legislature, eventually they will get it, then when they don't like it the most.
Okay, other questions, yes, or comments?
As far as the margin requirements on futures and stocks are concerned, the Federal Reserve is empowered to make the level playing field situation. Why don't they use it? It seems to be the most logical free enterprise way of going about this, to have a level playing field for everybody to have the same rules to play by.
It's a good question. I'll be meeting with Chairman Greenspan next week, I think it is. I'll raise it. Other questions or comments? Yes, sir.
Why can't the exchanges reinstate it for these programs? You can do it yourself without getting the government involved.
Well, that is also a good question. I was seeking comments, not questions. I don't take over till November 10th, so I cannot speak for the American Stock Exchange. That's clearly one of the areas I intend to look at and to get information for a policy decision relatively quickly.
Just as an add-on, we do not deal with brokers who were trading for their own account. We cut them off our list about 4 months ago.
Okay, this was very helpful, and I will pass along some of these comments, and I appreciate your candid advice. Thank you, Mark.
Okay, Jim. Please assure Administrator Riley that we have informed the audience of his entire curriculum vitae all the way back to spelling bee champion in the 6th grade, the Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, William Kane Riley. Mr. Riley.
Well, I'm very sorry to have, thank you for that introduction. I'm sure it was extensive and I gave you ample time to be thorough. I'm sorry to have arrived late. We've been in traffic for 35 minutes getting here from EPA. Usually a ride of about 15 at the most. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to speak to you. Looking down the agenda here, I think I might have felt a little picked on if I'd been left out. You have virtually a quorum of the cabinet, I think, that either has or will speak to you in the course of your 2 days here, and I accompanied Governor Sununu here yesterday at lunch to hear him speak. Last summer, some of you may know, there was the 15th Economic Summit of the so-called G7 heads of government and heads of state. It took place in Paris, France. And for the first time in the history of such summits, one head of government, the President of the United States, took his environmental advisor to that meeting. And in accompanying him to the place of meeting, the Pyramid of the Louvre, where we were going to discuss the environment with the other heads of government, I mentioned to him that though I had 5 sets of credentials for that highly security-conscious set of meetings, I lacked the credentials necessary for that particular session. He said, well, this is the one on the environment. And I said, well, I think the French perhaps were not accustomed or were not expecting me to come. But in any case, I don't have that particular credential badge. And he thought for a minute, and then he said, well, stick close to me. Maybe nobody will ask. And I did, and nobody asked. Which is actually not a bad philosophy for getting along in any administration. I detected at that summit, and in many of the international meetings and conferences held since then in the course of the past year, an unprecedented and altogether extraordinary interest in the quality of the environment on the part not just of the people of the United States, but of people throughout the world, and particularly the developed world. Earlier in the summer, I accompanied the President to Italy, and the first 5 questions in a press conference I held there with the Italian press concerned proposals to institute new air pollution controls in Southern California for Los Angeles, and questions about their specificity and about their possible applicability to problems in Italy, and in particular to automobile pollution issues in Milan. I think we see, certainly here in the United States, an extraordinary convergence between strong public interest and concern and presidential commitment that gives us the opportunity to reconcile our aspirations for the environment with our hopes and expectations for the economy in a way that has not been true for a long, long time, if ever, in this country. The administration's response to environmental problems has been steady and, I think, dramatic. We began the year with the President proposing to defer action on 3 offshore oil and gas lease sales proposed for 2 off the coast of California, 1 off the coast of Florida, in order to assess their environmental effects, at a cost to the budget revenues in this fiscal year of $450 million. The President proposed to ban all hazardous waste shipments from the United States to other countries unless those receiving countries have in place a system for assuring us about management and final disposal of that waste. The President committed the United States to go forward with a full phase-out of the manufacture and use of chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, which have been wreaking havoc with upper atmospheric ozone. We completed a report on Superfund, that much criticized, very complex program aimed at cleaning up derelict hazardous waste sites throughout the country, a program that we propose to refocus and strengthen, concentrating on enforcement and on innovative technologies. Most important of all, the President proposed a new Clean Air Act with sweeping provisions affecting smog, urban smog, the pollution of toxic materials from plants, from stationary sources around the country, and the first proposal ever from a president to address the acid rain problem that has so bedeviled the Northeast and also our neighbor, Canada. We have taken a leading role in helping the world understand and prepare to manage global climate change. We are this year, as you heard yesterday from Governor Sununu, proposing to spend about $500 million on various aspects of researching the uncertainties, of monitoring Earth systems, of setting up sensing systems, trying to resolve the large questions that the world community will be addressing in a conference I'm leaving for tonight in the Netherlands, a conference on global climate change. Our approach for working with the world community on these issues is to work with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a group that is sponsored by the United Nations Environment Program and the World Meteorological Organization, a group whose principal subgroup, the Response Strategies Working Group, that is preparing the analysis on policy measures, we chair, a meeting which we hosted at our invitation a couple of weeks ago in Geneva. We will again bring that data together to a meeting of the full plenary IPCC, again at our invitation here in Washington in early 1990. We have made environment a subject of our bilateral relationships with Poland and Hungary, including important new environmental initiatives for both those nations. And incidentally, in conversation with one of the Eastern European government ministers earlier this year, not Poland's or Hungary's, he made a remark to me to the effect that we find that as our people are being heard and have unprecedented influence, and we now must respond to them, what we find more and more is that they are deeply angry and concerned about the quality of their environment, of their air, and of their water. And so we want to be helpful. EPA is presently working on some 30 bilaterals with other countries, many of them in conditions like those in Eastern Europe and in the developing world, with long neglected environmental needs on which our country's experience and technology can be helpful. Well, finally, last week we made a number of new proposals to strengthen and streamline the country's management of pesticides, the control of products which pose inadvertent harm sometimes to the environment, on which we propose to continue to apply modern science on an accelerated basis with strengthened enforcement authority, and to move, once we have completed scientific analysis, with much more speed and decisiveness if we get the new authorities that the President's going to propose to the Congress for this law. Well, I think all of this is relevant, highly relevant, to the world of investment and corporate and business leadership, the national mood, the international attitudes, I think profoundly affect all of us. I just learned this morning before leaving the office of a Freedom of Information Act suit brought by the Sisters of Providence to compel EPA to reveal the enforcement experiences of a number of corporations in which the sisters are considering making investments with their investment portfolio. This, I learned, is one of any number of routine questions of this sort that we get, but the rate at which we are getting those questions is increasing very noticeably. But I'd like to focus more on the opportunities that I think are presented by the new convergence of public concern and governmental response. The philosophy that we have expressed in the Clean Air Act proposals that the President has made is very much a philosophy of performance, of saying to industry, automobile manufacturers and others, these are the standards that society wishes to see enforced. These are the expectations that the public will have with respect to air pollution. The precise manner in which you meet these expectations is left up to you. With respect to the control of toxic air pollution, we in fact invite industry to make proposals to us to substantially reduce air toxics according to a plan that they devise. And we commit that provided that the reductions are genuine, that the plan is a serious one, that will suffice. We will effectively approve that plan under the Bush proposals for the first phase accommodation, first 7 to 10 year phase of air toxics implementation. By the same token, in our acid rain proposals, we have designed a system of trading that will allow those targeted industries that can get reductions most cheaply to go ahead and get the reductions and effectively to do the job that others that might have a more difficult problem, a more expensive problem accommodating their requirements, will pay them to do under a system of trading allowances which will allow the most cost-effective investments for cleaning up this very serious problem of acid deposition. The message is we should be expected to determine what the public will require, but the manner in which these expectations are met is best left to those who are most familiar with the technology and the engineering and the business in which they're going to be achieved. That, I think you will see, will be a hallmark of much that the administration will propose with respect to the environment. Set strong standards, enforce them with consistency, and sureness, but leave the precise details of implementation to those who know their own business best. Business Week recently estimated that annual spending on products and services to clean up the environment will soar from $56 billion this year to $174 billion in 1995 in the United States alone. Now, there are 4 areas that I'd like to mention this morning where I think business leaders and investors might concentrate to help us improve the environment. First, I would encourage an examination of opportunities to invest in what we call pollution prevention. Many years ago, I heard someone say, a pollutant is a resource out of place. A number of American corporations have come to the same conclusion and have built in systems to change processes, to alter materials, to otherwise recapture or simply do without certain kinds of troublesome chemicals that create noxious and difficult to dispose of waste. And they have, many of them in the process, saved significant amounts of money. Others, by recapturing materials that formerly went out the stacks or into effluents as waste, have saved money. Some of those companies you are familiar with. Many have, in their advertising, noted this performance with pride. We encourage it. Pollution prevention will be a hallmark of the Environmental Protection Agency's strategy to managing the environment in the Bush administration. And I think there are significant opportunities for investments in process changes and materials recovery that should suggest. Second, I would encourage an examination of opportunities to invest in materials development. You know, waste disposal costs in the United States are soaring. Some years ago, it cost somewhere from $9 to $10 to $15 a ton to dispose of solid waste. On average, I think the number is now in the range of $50 a ton. In some places, it's over $120 a ton. There will inevitably be, as a consequence both of our environmental laws and of the increasing costs of waste disposal, much more attention on recycling and reuse. Shrewd manufacturers and investors in the future, I believe, increasingly will look at the full life cycle of a product. And they'll ask the question, not just how do you make it most efficiently, but how will it be used? What will be its byproduct? Where will it end up? And what kinds of problems will it create when it does? In the years ahead, I think that the recyclability of a product will also have a significant impact on its saleability as environment-conscious consumers increasingly buy green. Third, we are in very serious need of more innovative and efficient pollution cleanup technologies. This was driven home to me most dramatically when I first laid eyes on the full dimensions of the oil spill in Prince William Sound last March, 11.5 million gallons of crude oil in that pristine area, and a response capability that technologically had not advanced much in 20 years. Skimmers that were wholly inadequate to the job, booms that were not truly effective, dispersants that had not been fully vetted for environmental effects, and certainly a woeful lack of pre-positioned equipment to respond to a catastrophe of that magnitude. But not just with respect to oil spills, rather we're going to need upgraded technology to treat water effluents, to manage sewage, improve our treatment plants, and new techniques and new technologies for cleaning up coal and making high sulfur coal more economical and more usable. and more compatible with the environment. Fourth, I'd like to suggest a hard look at emerging or rediscovered environmental technologies. Global warming and ozone depletion are issues that will have enormous implications for new technologies. In conversation with a Japanese minister not long ago, he made the point that the Japanese are preparing to establish a new institute and to invest significant resources in the technologies that the world community will need to respond to climate change. I think across the world we are going to want to see responses to this problem, and that as we see them, we are also likely to see that they will present not just problems and dislocations for the world community, but opportunities to advance technology and to achieve related problems of energy use reduction, more energy efficiency, pollution control, and so forth at the same time. Let me let you in on one other initiative that I hope will open up some new avenues of investment. I want to announce today that I'm appointing, at President Bush's request, a high-level advisory panel to be known as the Advisory Board on International Transfer of Environmental Technology. This action is an outgrowth of the recent economic summit in Paris, which declared that greater international cooperation is needed to enhance environmental technology transfer. It responds to a problem that we hear a great deal about from leaders of the developing world who want access to substitutes to chlorofluorocarbons, to new technologies for managing waste and protecting their groundwater, and other kinds of technologies of that sort. This board, which I am very pleased to say will be chaired by my very distinguished predecessor, Bill Ruckelshaus, now chairman of Browning-Ferris Corporation, will initially have the job of looking at ways to help low-income countries meet the problems of ozone depletion and global warming. The board's ultimate goal will be to facilitate the transfer of U.S. environmental technology to foreign countries which otherwise could not afford it. I expect that the board's recommendations, which are to be ready in time for the economic summit here in the United States next summer, will include greater export and investment opportunities for the manufacturers of these technologies. Well, in all these examples, I think there are ample opportunities for investors in the field of environmental protection. And let me close by reading a passage from a recent issue of the London Economist entitled, "Growth Can Be Green." The greenest countries, the Economist said, can expect an added bonus. Their firms will meet tough regimes at home, so they will be well poised to clean up, in both senses of that word, to clean up when dirtier countries see the light. America's early ban on CFCs and aerosols pushed its chemical giants ahead in the race to find ozone-friendly alternatives. Sweden's tough rules on pollution by paper makers gave its paper industry an international lead. Whole new worlds of green technology and business opportunity are now opening up. Giant vacuum cleaners that suck pests off organic vegetables, bugs that eat up toxic waste, chemical-free ways to purify swimming pools. So from my vantage point as EPA administrator, I think that the bottom line couldn't be clearer. I'm convinced that environmental research and development present a major opportunity for business, for industry, for investors. I very much hope that my agency can collaborate closely with many companies in the development of such technologies. We desperately need them, particularly in the hazardous waste area, to give us an economic and technological breakthrough with respect to the cleanup of the 1,200 or so hazardous waste dumps that are now listed on the national priority list for cleanup, the expenses for which, absent technology, are extremely daunting. So I'd just like to encourage you to think about investing in the future of some of these technologies, of helping solve some of these problems, thinking about investments in environmental protection. I think the investment community can play a very important role in helping to unchain the modern Prometheus. I said to the biotechnology industry the other day, we're looking for great contributions from that industry, an industry that has been greeted warily by some critics, particularly in the environmental community. I think could scarcely make a more constructive and imaginative contribution than to help us clean this country up. So let's turn technology loose. Let's see what new wonders can be put in service to facilitate and advance the course of human progress. Thank you.
We just take a couple of quick questions. Thanks very much. Thank you. Administrator Riley has agreed to take a couple of questions. I know that we have them, so please speak up and whatever question you do have. Right here.
You'll find that one of the problems is who's going to pick up the tab for all these problems. Would you have any idea what the magnitude is in terms of GNP or in any other terms of the problem on a short-term or longer-term basis? What inflationary pressures are?
The question is basically who's going to pay, and do I have any idea about the magnitude of the impacts of some of these costs from cleaning up the environment, impacts on inflation and GNP? Well, I can tell you that we have closely analyzed and tried to cost the economic implications of the Clean Air Act proposals we've made. We now as a country spend something in the range of $35 billion a year on air pollution control. That's measured against a zero control basis. We will add, if the measures the President has proposed are enacted as we propose them, something between $14 and $19 billion a year to those costs. That is substantial. It is often looked at, however, in isolation, and it's not looked at in connection with the thousands of days lost in productive work on the part of much of the population, the impaired productivity costs that asthmatics and others experience as a consequence of air pollution problems, and the very severe materials damage associated, particularly with acid rain. So if you do the cost-benefit, I think you come out, and this, in fact, the Reagan administration's Domestic Policy Council concluded in 1987 that it's essentially a wash, at least, no significant cost associated with the acid rain measures that are not more than offset by benefits. On the larger question, we are as attentive to the cost impact of all of these initiatives as we can be. And that is one reason for choosing such approaches as the trading system in the acid rain proposal. According to our estimate, that measure itself will reduce the cost of acid rain cleanup, and those costs I cited to you are costs that are going to occur early in the next century when the air pollution program is mature. They're not going to occur next year. The consequence of the trading system is to reduce the acid rain cost by about 20 to 25%, about $800 million to $1 billion a year is the reduction you get from using the Bush approach. It's one that is currently under some attack in the Congress, and yet I think to the extent that it is really understood as achieving environmental benefits, but achieving them in a much more cost-effective way, it ought to be embraced by everyone, and it has now been embraced by much of the environmental community.
Yes, right over here, please.
Using high technology, full steam ahead, sometimes there are accidents along the way, and our main...
Sometimes there are what?
Accidents. And as you may know, or you know certainly, a lot of our bigger corporations have heavy liability suits that have been on their books and for which they spend a lot of money in order to defend themselves. Do you see any kind of legislation or any kind of elimination or partial elimination of this problem for our companies involved in environmental waste disposal?
The question is, do I see any legislation or any solutions to the problem of companies involved in waste disposal that now are afflicted by very large potential liabilities? That has been an increasingly serious problem, and I think to the extent that it really does impede cleanup, we have to consider some alternatives to the present approach. What those are, I'm not prepared to say. We are going to be going forward with new legislative proposals on the Resource Conservation Recovery Act and then later Superfund over the next year and a half or so. And we'll look very closely at the concerns that have been expressed that fear of liability has in fact impeded the job of cleaning these areas up. Obviously, the more definitive and unavoidable liabilities that now attend dealing with hazardous waste have gotten industry's attention. They have caused waste to be taken much more seriously. I think they are themselves resulting in efforts to reduce the generation of hazardous waste and to deal with this problem farther back in the system. But I'm very familiar with claims that perhaps in some areas they've gone too far and willing to look at them.
No? Okay. I thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Ryan.
Very welcome.
Thank you very much, Administrator Riley. Our Washington traffic is holding up our next speaker as well. Let me run through his introduction because it is truly an interesting introduction. He's an interesting man. I don't know if the introduction will do him justice. The Democrats lost the presidency again in 1988, but unlike past defeats, the Democrats' party platform had not been used against them effectively by the Republicans during the 1988 campaign. In the past, the Democratic Party platform had been described not inaccurately as the world's longest suicide note. And in 1988, the reason that the platform became a more pragmatic and more defensible document, credit for that goes in large part to Bill Gray, the Democratic congressman from Philadelphia, a Baptist minister since 1964. He is a rather remarkably successful politician who has been elected by his colleagues in the House as chairman of the House Committee on the Budget, a position which he followed Jim Jones. After that, he was elected chairman of the Democratic Caucus, and this last spring, in the shakeup in the House Democratic leadership, Bill Gray of Philadelphia was elected to the important number 3 leadership position of House Majority Whip. He won these positions, did Bill Gray, with significant support from white Southern conservative Democrats. He himself is a black Democrat from Philadelphia, and he forged this rather fascinating coalition. It was explained to me by one of the most resourceful and most conservative House Democrats. I asked him who in the leadership he really felt comfortable with. He said, no doubt about it, Bill Gray. I can deal with Bill Gray. In 1988, the conservative commentator George Will urged the nomination of Bill Gray upon the Democrats for their national ticket as a running mate for their presidential candidate. That was not seriously considered in 1988, but nobody is certainly ruling it out for 1992 or beyond. He is recognized as one of the leaders of his party and certainly one of the leaders of the Congress. And we expect him to be here momentarily. Prior to his arrival, let me just return briefly to the point I was trying to make about the emerging definition of national security. We are really breaking out of the mold in this country politically in how we will define national security. And the point I made yesterday about the split level of our politics, where the Republicans have been seen as strong and decisive and forceful in the past, The question, I think, that's open and unresolved at this point is whether, in fact, the Democrats, with their leadership, are prodding at least on the Eastern Europe and overtures to aid and initiatives to aid are reasserting themselves in the international arena, an area where they have been, quite frankly, defective and perceived as weak by most American voters. But to answer that and all kinds of other questions, from Pennsylvania, the House Majority Whip, Congressman Bill Gray.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that long introduction while you were patiently awaiting my arrival. And to all of you who are here at this very important conference, I am delighted to come. Please forgive me for being late, but yesterday afternoon, the President called a meeting of the congressional leadership this morning, and that meeting just adjourned about 15 minutes ago. And he is now in a press conference announcing that he will be meeting with the head of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, and in December, and also reporting back to the Congress on the recent meeting in Costa Rica with regard to a celebration of democracy there. So please forgive me for being late. I am delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be here for a variety of reasons. One, to have Mark Shields introduce you is something of a great joy. I'm sorry I missed that long introduction. I'm sure I'll get a tape of it. Then secondly, I am also delighted to be here because of the new chair of the American Stock Exchange, and that is someone who helped to get me into all the trouble that I'm in. When I came to Congress as a freshman, I joined a committee called the Budget Committee because someone said, in the future, that's where the action is going to be. And so sitting about 4 or 5 seats up from me was a gentleman from Oklahoma who represented a district in Oklahoma, and I watched him carefully as he articulated the issues of fiscal policy, and he became a role model, and the next thing I knew, he became chairman of the Budget Committee, and I decided that I wanted to grow up and be just like Jim Jones of Oklahoma. And so I ran for Budget Committee chairman, and guess what? I won. He didn't tell me that you shouldn't win. And so I am delighted to be here and to share this occasion with my good friend and the new chair, Jim Jones of Oklahoma, who provided so much great leadership for this country as the distinguished chair of the Budget Committee. Let me just take a few moments, if I might, and share with you some perspectives as I see them with regard to the new administration and the 101st Congress. Of course, we are all aware that there's a new Congress and a new administration. And if I had to describe the relationship between the Congress and the administration, I would say that it has been characterized primarily by cooperation and by compromise, and that George Bush, as president, has had to recognize something that his predecessor did not have to face in his first term. When Ronald Reagan became the president in 1981, he became president, head of the executive branch, but the Senate was in Republican hands, and for all practical purposes, the House was effectively in control of a coalition between the Republican Party and conservative Democrats. And thus, for the first 2 or 3 years, President Reagan was able to get about 95% of his legislative agenda put in place. The difference between this president and this Congress is that this president does not have a majority in either the House or the Senate. And there's one thing you must say about American politicians. In our democracy, there's one thing that binds us all together, and that is that we can all count very well. And George Bush can count very well. And so when he looks at the Senate and sees it firmly in the control of Democrats, he looks in the House and sees it firmly in the control of Democrats, he knows that he is facing a new situation quite different from his predecessor. And as a result of that, I think you have seen an administration that has been characterized by more pragmatism, more consensus building, and more bipartisanship. And the Congress has also responded in a like manner. Let me point out 2 or 3 issues. the savings and loan crisis. Regardless of how you may feel about the worth of the S&L bailout, the substance, the fact is that the administration came forth with a plan. The Congress had some problems with certain aspects. There was a working together and eventually a bipartisan compromise without a great deal of confrontation and partisanship. When it comes to Central American foreign policy, which had been a place of conflict for the Congress and the previous administration, this president sat down and worked out a bipartisan compromise on Central American foreign policy. And the same thing can be said of a variety of other issues, including the declaration of war against drugs in this country, a bipartisan compromise worked out, and also with regard to the budget. The first budget submitted by this administration being built on the foundation of the last administration. The president submitted his budget for deficit reduction and listing the priorities of our nation. However, when Congress balked and said, we don't particularly agree with those, instead of having a long confrontation period, there was a sitting down, quietly working out a bipartisan budget compromise. Now, many people will say that compromise did very, very little to reduce the deficit and lacked any significant substance. And those who would say that, I would probably say you are right. I call that compromise a help me make it through the night budget. The night being getting beyond the Graham-Rudman sequestration and targets. Where we are now is that we are still trying to implement that budget by passing the necessary legislation for reconciliation that will bring us down under the Graham-Rudman-Hollins targets and thus avoid across-the-board cuts. Essentially, I think that within the next week to 2 weeks, there will be a bipartisan agreement on a reconciliation package, and the across-the-board cuts of sequestration that should apply as a result of the Graham-Rudman law will not actually occur. They will occur definitely by the first week of December. However, I think we will get the reconciliation bill done, and it will not occur. However, despite the bipartisan compromise nature of events around Washington, a big change from the last 4 years of the Reagan administration, there have been some notable exceptions, some confrontation. That confrontation has been around a couple of issues. One, the most recent and the biggest confrontation was the Congress confronting the president on the issue of capital gains tax cut. The administration campaigned on that issue. The president wanted to have a reduction, and the leadership of the House opposed that reduction, came up with a substitute plan, and I don't need to tell you who won. Whenever you have a popular president in his first year in office, if he decides to spend his political capital, his mandate, on any particular issue, more than likely he is going to win. Particularly when 64 Democrats abandoned the leadership to vote with the president, and of those 64, all but 13 had their districts won by the occupant of the White House. You can see the good politics involved there. And so President Bush won the issue in the House. However, the battle still continues in the Senate, where Senator Mitchell, the majority leader, and the Democratic leadership has been successful in defeating attempts to cut the capital gains rate. I believe that that issue is going to be eventually resolved, not in reconciliation, but in a separate vehicle after we do reconciliation, and it may not occur this fall. It may have to wait until next year. There are many of us who believe that this is the wrong time to unravel tax reform, and that is what the capital gains cut would do, that the bill that was passed in the House actually increases the deficit over the long term, and thus will not be good for long-term economic growth and prosperity. And finally, it is not equitable because it provides most of the benefits to the wealthiest citizens of our society and not providing significant relief, if you are going to give tax relief, to the vast majority in America. And so there's been a confrontation on that issue. I find it interesting that we have spent so much of our time in September and October fighting capital gains tax cut issues rather than dealing with the most important issue, which is a substantive deficit reduction package. But be that as it may, that is the one place where there has been partisan confrontation. The president won in the House. He is still yet to win in the Senate on that issue. The other place where there has been some partisanship, and this brings me to a subject which I think many of you are concerned about, is the issue of foreign assistance, as seen in the president's proposals to provide aid for Poland. I think clearly we in the Congress, and Democrats as well as Republicans, want to push forward the democratization process that is going on in Poland and the potential for other liberalizations in other Warsaw Pact nations. The president came forth with a package which most members of Congress thought was absolutely too small and would not send the strongest possible signal that we stand firmly behind economic liberalization and also democratic restructuring of the political order. And so the Congress, in its wisdom, decided to greatly increase the amount of money that would be made available to assist Poland. And I think what that says is that this Congress, the 101st Congress, wherever you see a country that is moving toward a liberalization of its economic structure, away from socialism, more toward free enterprise, you are going to probably find a Congress that is willing to respond with significant assistance, particularly if that economic liberalization is going to provide for a change in the political structure. And thus, Democrats will be strongly supporting, I think, in many areas, increased aid. Of course, the problem we face in all of these areas is the problem of the national debt and the deficit, because essentially the president has said, read my lips, no new taxes. Democrats are not anxious to go out and raise new taxes. However, if you are going to invest in education, if you're going to clean up the environment, if you're going to be in the leadership of providing foreign assistance to help democratize and bring about free markets, if you are going to be in the leadership of space and science, if you are going to deal with domestic problems such as the drug war here at home, and if you are going to be able to invest in the infrastructure and deal with natural disasters like that occurred in California, eventually you have to move beyond rhetoric and decide where you're going to get those resources from. And there are only two ways of doing it. One is to cut some existing program and transfer the resources. That becomes extremely difficult when we have already crunched down very significantly on domestic discretionary spending, and that there is no consensus for a real crunch down on Pentagon spending. There's a consensus to limit the growth of the Pentagon, and there is no one who is anxious to take on the entitlement programs. And so thus the ability to cut and transfer to new investment opportunities, whether domestically or in foreign policy, are very, very limited. And thus what you end up with is rhetoric that sounds good, but no resources to back them up. Eventually, we will have to face up to the question of revenues. And already we have seen Senator Bob Dole come forward this weekend announcing that he was prepared to support a gasoline tax for infrastructure investment for roads, bridges, and other infrastructure investment needs here in America. That will continue to be the driving force, in my opinion, behind all public policy in the administration as well as on Capitol Hill. And it is a dilemma and a challenge that we have yet to meet. I believe, however, that working with this new president will be quite different from working with the past president, simply because George Bush can count, and he understands that he has to compromise and work in a new relationship with a Congress that is firmly in the control of the Democrats. And thus, the outlook, I think, is that in this first year of the new administration and new Congress don't expect major new directions. What we have to understand is what has happened in American national politics and why the Democrats can be so strong in what I call the America's Party, representing the broad spectrum of the American people, and be strong in Congress, in the State House, in the governor's mansion, and in the city councils and local races. We are the strongest party. But yet, as Mark has pointed out and others have pointed out, we have yet to be able to win consistently the White House. And in fact, in the last 20 years, we've only had the place for about 4 years. And that was a fellow named Jimmy Carter, who was there for a brief period. And then, of course, we Democrats shot ourselves in the head by, running somebody against our own incumbent president in the primary. Of course, when you do that, you're making it very difficult. What is it that has kept us from being successful winning the White House while at the same time winning the Senate, winning the House of Representatives, winning most of the governor's races, winning most of the mayor races, county races? In my opinion, it comes down to about 3 or 4 things, Mark. One, the American public has changed in its approach to selecting a president. 30 years ago, you selected your president by, I'm a Democrat, you're a Republican, I'm voting for the Democrat. I don't know him, I haven't seen him, I maybe heard the voice on the radio or saw a picture on the front page of the newspaper, but my congressman, my mayor, my governor, my sheriff, all tell me to vote Democratic, and that's what I'm going to do. And that's basically the way political races for president were carried out over 30 years ago in this country. That all changed, ladies and gentlemen, about 30 years ago, when suddenly a young Massachusetts Democrat won the White House, defeating a Republican named Nixon, and people began to give the credit to the fact that he won the television debate. And so from about the period of John F. Kennedy winning the White House, we entered a period of what I call electronic campaigning, where increasingly the American people could see the candidate for themselves, hear the candidate for themselves, make judgments about the candidate, his character or her character, and then without the aid of the congressman, the senator, the governor, and the old political organization, make an independent judgment as to which person they wanted to be their president. And as a result, if you look at polls, you will find that about 30% of the population says, I'm a Democrat, I'll vote for a Democrat no matter who it is. We call them yellow dog Democrats because they would vote for a yellow dog as long as it was a Democrat. Then there are those, I don't know what we call them, purple dog Republicans. About 30% of the population, when you poll them in America, says, I'm a Republican, I've been a Republican, I believe in Republicanism, I'm going to vote Republican even if you give me a purple dog. And what has happened over the last 30 years is there's been a growing group of independent voters, some who identify as Republicans, some who identify as Democrats, and some who just identify as Democrats. And they have been the swing voters in every election. And they are making that decision by looking at that television, making the judgments themselves, and often the judgment has nothing to do with issues, as 1988's campaign, I think, clearly proved that you don't have to campaign too much on issues to get elected. Second thing I would say is that Democrats failed to master, as the Republicans learned to master after the Nixon defeat, the electronic campaign tools. And thus they were light years ahead of us in being able to use those tools effectively in communicating a message, a coherent message, a party message, which made it easier for people to select their candidate. Thirdly, I think Republicans have also learned that you don't reinvent the wheel, and we Democrats like to reinvent it. By that I mean every time we get a new Democratic candidate, he or she has to go out and hire a whole new staff of people who never, some of them, have had any experience in running national political campaigns. And so thus you get the situation where you get wonderful human beings, bright, talented, good people, but they're up against old pros. And, you know, if you've got a choice between backing Bill Gray from Philadelphia or Randall Cunningham from Philadelphia, and the game is football, I would advise you to bet on Randall Cunningham because he's got a little more experience. And so what you end up with is situations, because we reinvent the wheel, where you get a wonderful person, Mr. Bronhus, as the chief campaign person for our candidate, up against Jim Baker, who has been there in many presidential campaigns at least a half a dozen times. You get Susan, what was the lady's name? Estridge. See, I can't even remember the name. That ought to tell you something. Who ends up being opposed, the opposite of Lee Atwater. Lee Atwater's had 4 or 5 presidential campaigns under his belt. Susan, a brilliant Harvard lawyer, a wonderful human being, but has never really gotten in at that level. So what we tend to do as Democrats is we go out and start a fresh new team. They have learned to bring the wealth of experience, victory and defeat to the table. And then finally, and most importantly, we have a problem, I think, within our own party. And that is we are a broad-based party. We stretch all the way from Chuck Schumer in New York to Charlie Stenholm in Texas. And believe me, if you don't know those names, that's about left to right as far as you can go. But that represents who we are as a party. We represent all of the political points of view, all of the regions. I think the major problem that we have not dealt with is how do you select a candidate who can bring the entire party together and not select one that is either to the left or to the right so far that those on the right abandon or those on the left abandon. And I think what has to happen is we have to develop a real hunger for the White House, a real wanting to go back to the White House, Mark, for dinners, breakfasts, being able to pick up the phone and calling a president or a secretary and getting something done. And when we get that real hunger again, then those to the left will say, well, that candidate doesn't believe in everything I believe in, but he or she's a Democrat, they're close enough. And then those on the right will say, that candidate is not exactly the most conservative, moderate Democrat I would have chosen, but they're close enough, and I want to be able to go to the White House and have breakfast, lunch, dinner, and more importantly, as a congressman, I want to be able to pick up the phone and call a secretary and ask for some help back in my district. And until we develop that, we will not come together around a candidate who not only can win the primary, but most importantly, win the general election. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Joe. Good to see you, sir. Thank you very much, Congressman Gray. As the United States Trade Representative, Ambassador Carla Hills is President Bush's principal advisor on international trade policy. She is this country's chief trade negotiator representing American interests in International Trade Forum. Born in Los Angeles, Carla Hills was educated at Stanford and Oxford, received her law degree from Yale, was Secretary of Housing and Urban Development in President Ford's cabinet. It's true, as somebody, either Wayne Newton or Isaac Newton said, ideas have no gender. We learn hourly from Carla Hills that leadership and forcefulness are not the exclusive franchise of either gender. Carla Hills.
Well, I'm delighted to be here this morning before this very prestigious audience, and I'm here to give you a word about the Bush administration's trade policy. I thought I would speak for about 10 minutes and then promptly yield when the chairman of the Finance Committee arrives, who I understand is the next speaker, but will be answering your questions until that occurs. And let me just say that our trade strategy is very simple, but I think very powerful. It is to open markets so that we can expand trade and to adopt a clear set of enforceable rules so as to avoid trade controversy, which always interrupts trade. And you may ask why we feel so keenly about opening markets and expanding trade. And that is because we see that as the key to worldwide prosperity. We look back to the 4 decades since the Second World War, and we give major part of the credit to the 40 years of unparalleled growth in world history, to the increase of trade, which we believe came from the tariff reductions pursuant to the GATT. And we would like to do that all over again. So in order to accomplish our trade strategy, our objectives are threefold, but first and foremost, to have a successful conclusion of the multilateral negotiations now ongoing in the Uruguay round. And as you know, the Uruguay round is the 8th round in history. We have had 7 rounds before, most directed toward the reduction in tariffs, and we have had gains there. But this round seeks to liberalize trade in 15 ambitious areas. We have about $1 trillion of trade per year that is not covered by international rules. Agriculture is inadequately covered. The area of services, investment, and intellectual property is not covered at all. And we have a weakness in rules governing subsidies by governments and for disciplines governing trade disputes. We would like to correct that because we do think that the trade that would result would generate worldwide wealth. So the United States has a program of having an ambitious trade package. We want to have a result in the Uruguay round at its conclusion in December of 1990 that will enable all of the 97 nations that are truly participating to take something home to their legislative body and feel that the gain is so important that they're willing to join in the consensus. And that is why we have put forth ambitious proposals in agriculture, why last week we put forth a very ambitious proposal in the area of services. You may ask, why services? We have about $500 billion a year in trade and services, which is not covered by international discipline. About 68% of the gross domestic product in the United States is in services, and more than 3/4 of our jobs are in services. And in the last decade, 90% of new jobs came out of services. What we want are services providers to be able to establish in a foreign land and be not discriminated against, but be treated like the domestic providers of services. And we want those rules to be clear and predictable. We want there to be an enforcement mechanism in the event that there is a trade controversy. Now, when I travel, I try to push the Uruguay round and the benefits which I honestly believe will come to all nations from having an ambitious, successful conclusion. And I also discuss our bilateral issues, and there are always a handful of those with our trading partners. And of course, we do use the leverage of our open and free market to try to achieve openness in other markets around the world. I have taken a number of trips this year. This past September, I was in Europe for 9 days visiting 7 capitals. And it was instructive because in those 7 capitals, I tried to encourage an ambitious, creative, bold approach to the Uruguay round, which we feel is so important to trade and prosperity in the 21st century. And I also talked about the impediments to trade, which we worry may be cropping up in Europe. One in particular is the emphasis on forced investment. The manner in which the European community interprets the rule of origin in dumping cases against the Japanese does have a preference toward investment in Europe as opposed to products traded to Europe. And I wanted the Europeans to be alerted to the notion that this is creating very deep concern in this country. We did have a fruitful discussion with 5 commissioners, and Mr. Andreasen did make a statement saying that was neither the intent nor the purpose, and that we are now engaged in bilateral discussions, hopefully to have a clear rule of origin to avoid that confusion. Subsequently, I went to Korea, where we had, I think, a very constructive set of discussions, meeting with the President and all members of his cabinet, including the opposition in the National Assembly. And the day that I left, I was handed by the opposition leaders an Assembly resolution unanimously passed, which stated that Korea was in favor of liberalization in the area of telecommunications, wanted to have more effective enforcement in intellectual property rights, and would take steps to liberalize its agricultural market. And you probably have read in the paper that last week Korea very courageously disinvoked the use of a balance of payment exception to the GATT. What that means is it's the first lesser developed country that has emerged that will take on the responsibilities of the multilateral trading system. Because today there is about $500 billion in trade by the lesser developed world, which assumes no responsibility at all, but simply claims that they are special and different, and will claim the exception under a balance of payment rule. And so we have an enormous amount of applause for Korea, which has disinvoked, and we hope that it starts a parade for the lesser developed world as they get stronger balance sheets, and they are, at least those that have an outward-looking economy are, and that they will assume the leadership role that they have now demonstrated in galvanizing the lesser developed world in the Uruguay round. And from Korea, I went on to Japan to meet with the current Prime Minister and the former Prime Minister, along with his cabinet, to talk about a handful of bilateral issues that we have with Japan as well as the Uruguay round. We have enormous frustration in this country that emanates from the fact that we perceived ourselves as not having the same opportunities in the Japanese market as Japanese entrepreneurs, both traders and investors, have in our own market. And that frustration is extraordinarily detrimental to the multilateral trading system, which is the basis of the economic miracle that Japan has enjoyed. There are few nations that export so much or invest so broadly that would be so adversely affected by a world turning inward, either inward because there is a gravitation toward trading blocs, or inward because individual nations cannot keep their borders open because of the political frustration. And I am very hopeful that by reason of frank and open discussions on our bilateral issues, which cover the areas of supercomputers, satellites, forest products, semiconductors, telecommunications, and construction, that we can have progress in what we have launched under the rubric of the Structural Impediments Initiative. This is a bilateral effort that the President announced last spring, whereby we want to get at broader economic defects in our respective economy. And we have identified for the Japanese the pricing mechanisms, the distribution mechanisms, land use planning, the interlocks amongst businesses, the anti-competitive practices, and for their part, the Japanese have identified our abysmally low savings rate, our need for greater emphasis on quality control, education and training, and I welcome a focus on those areas, which I think we would undertake in our own best interests in any event, so that we come back to the United States again, launching a major effort to open markets and expand trade. I am leaving this Friday for Canberra, where we will be talking to the nations of the Pacific Rim about greater economic cooperation. And always at those meetings, there's an opportunity for bilateral dialogue on the issues that could be significant not only to the nations individually involved, but also to our greater purpose, our multilateral negotiations. For I should tell you that the United States uses its bilateral discussions to complement its efforts in the Uruguay round. And you will notice in the areas that I have ticked off for Japan, or those for Korea, or our concerns with the European community, are all areas which would, if we had a successful conclusion to the Uruguay round, be handled because of enhanced disciplines. And from Canberra, I will return to Japan for the annual quadrilateral meeting of trade ministers, which includes the United States, Canada, the European community, and Japan, an informal discussion of issues that are of concern to the four of us, and then on to the informal ministerial, a grouping of 30 trade ministers from 30 countries to galvanize the world community for a successful conclusion over the next 13 months in the round. And we will have meetings that follow into 1990. The time is short. The United States has been ambitious in its effort. We have tabled more than 70 proposals, and by the 31st of December, we will be tabling perhaps 7 more than any other single nation, which shows the extraordinary effort and resolve that we take toward this trade opening opportunity. We see ourselves literally at a crossroads where, because these liberalization measures take somewhere between 5 and 10 years to phase in for many nations, that we will enter the 21st century with a promise of greater trade and greater worldwide prosperity, or if we fail, we will have the peril of much more contracted trade, much less opportunity for wealth, and a very grim picture for the 21st century. Being an undying optimist, I think we can do it, but it really takes the resolve of all of us. And now I'd be delighted to take your questions.
Would you just repeat the question because people can't hear it? Sure. Question for Ambassador Hill.
Let's see. Yes, sir.
You were in Japan recently, and I believe the discussion put between yourselves and they were over, they wouldn't accept the baby's bottles, and that was reported, and of course you poo-pooed that, which I gave you great credit for. Don't you feel that they've been playing games with us? They know all the issues. They're very well cognizant of the fact that it's an unfair playing field that we've been in. They played in our sandbox, we can't play in theirs. And they're going to continue to do so, I think. You tell me.
If the question is, isn't it unfair the way the Japanese intentionally invest in this country and preclude us from entering their country, and they trivialize trade by landing on small issues? I would say this, that there is a greater awareness worldwide that the need to open the market is very real if we are to capture the potential for prosperity that is just beyond our grasp. And the fact of the matter is that we cannot accomplish our trade strategy of opening markets and expanding trade without the participation of the Japanese. The first largest market in the world and the second largest market in the world simply must join hands for their mutual benefit. And I believe that we are hearing in the Japanese highest tribunals a recognition of this fact. It is not only Carla Hills or the Bush administration that is saying that you must open your market, but you're having the Economic Policy Agency and MITI and the foreign minister appreciate the fact that there must be a greater opening of the market. It will not happen overnight, and it's not going to be easy, but it must be done. And we tell the Japanese that this is in their own best interest, not only because their consumers toil so long for so little, but because if they are to continue on the path of being investors and a great trading nation, they simply are going to have to open their market, or the political realities are the market is going to contract and particularly in the first largest market in the world.
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Can you tell us something about your perspective of the external relations of the European community because of the 1992 initiative? It seems to me that the Americans are expecting much more from it than the Europeans do themselves for the external relations.
The question is, what are my views of 1992, and do Americans expect more than even the Europeans with the transformation of that market into a single market? We expect a lot. There's a lot of potential. You erase the barriers amongst those 12 nations and create 320 million consumers, a $4 trillion market, the largest market in the world. There is a potential that simply shimmers with commercial opportunity, without question. And the Americans, since the very beginning, back at the Marshall Plan, we gave about $88 billion in 88 terms. We have hailed the march toward the single market by supporting the economic community. We have certainly hailed the march in the current transformation in the Treaty of Rome, and we will continue to do so because we do believe that by getting government out of the way, that we can have a greater potential for worldwide trade to the benefit of all the world's people. But having said all that, we are very wary and vigilant, and we watch lest the barriers that are being removed amongst the 12 states will be erected at the perimeter of the body. And that is what we are talking to our European counterparts about. And that is why when I was in Europe in September, I was concerned about the forced investment rule. And that is why the American people watch with some dismay the debate over local content, whereby the Nissan Bluebird has difficulty in getting from the UK down to France, a sister state which sends reverberations not only in our automotive sector, but in all sectors, because there is a view that that could be a rule applied to us. And similarly so in the broadcast directive. The Europeans may have been surprised that we reacted so strongly to this control over thought, which requires a majority of content be European origin. And it simply set another reverberation, not only through the communications industry, but through all industries, that here is another step to preclude free market-oriented flows of trade and investment. So the answer to your question is we see a marvelous opportunity, and we would like to see that opportunity left open for the benefit of Europeans as well as all of the world's traders, by eliminating and not duplicating restrictions on the perimeter. Yes?
There's a view expressed by some economists that the U.S. is the only major economy that has a tax system which subsidizes imports and penalizes exports. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that subject. Is there validity to that point of view? And does your department voice points of view in this direction in the administration today?
The question is that it is the view of some economists that U.S. tax law subsidizes, a very bad phrase, subsidizes imports and penalizes exports. And would I comment on that, particularly the fact, on the fact of whether or not the agency, the United States Trade Representative's Office, has an opportunity to talk about these issues. We do not believe that we subsidize imports. We do believe that there are some incentives that could be developed with respect to savings that would tend to restrict the trade deficit, which creates this enormous political pressure on trade policy. Now that is a fact. As far as the size and function of the USTR, what we do is very simple. We coordinate trade policy for the U.S. government, and we negotiate trade agreements. And by coordination, We deal with all of the departments of agencies in government in the most inclusive fashion so that we can report to the President that one agency is in favor of a certain trade policy or objective, and 6 may not be in favor, and this is where we come out, and this is why. And so that the President has all of the facts at his fingertips and can make the decision that works into our trade policy. And I think in the 10 months that the Bush administration has been in office, this inclusive process has worked and served us very well. Yes?
Deterioration of your trade balances with the oil-producing countries so far. How do you see this evolve in the next 18 months, and how do you see the trade gap evolve in general, the U.S. trade gap evolving in the next 18 months?
The question concerns our trade deficit or our trade balance with the oil-producing nations, and more generally our trade balances in a forecast sense. Our trade deficit in general, let me answer the general question first, is simply a function of macroeconomic factors. We know that in this country. We know that by opening markets, we will not erase our trade deficit, that we need to import foreign capital to fill the gap between our low savings rate and our higher rate of investment. And that gap, if all markets were open, could still continue if our rate of production did not equal our rate of consumption. We know that. But having said all that, we want to have trade open, trade markets open, so that we can keep all the factories humming at top levels, top utilization rates, and people employed, and because there is an impact, not a macro impact, but a micro impact on the deficit and the opportunities to eliminate the deficit. As far as where the balances will be with the cartel that deals with oil in foreign markets, it would be hard to project that over the next 24 months, and I'm certainly not prepared to give a figure from this podium. Yes?
The appetite of the Japanese on the American businesses, as illustrated by this morning's front page acquisition of percentage of $848 million they bought for Rockefellers. What is your views on that?
Question is, what is my feeling about the appetite of the Japanese to invest in the United States, with particular reference to Mitsubishi's purchase of the Rockefeller interest this morning? We in the Bush administration feel quite keenly that we have gained a great deal from having investment markets open, so that we are in favor of no impediments to investment, but worldwide opportunities for investment. Having said that, we would like to have the same opportunities abroad that other nations enjoy here. And other nations have gained immeasurably from investing in our market, just as we have gained immeasurably from investing worldwide. Indeed, we think the gains that we have derived are very, very substantial and exceed the gains that others have obtained here, if you take the replacement cost of our investments all around the world. As to the appetite of the Japanese, were I with the Japanese and looking at the most stable, open, energetic market in the world, I certainly would be attracted to our shores. But I think the question is better put to the Japanese as to their appetite.
Yes.
I have a question. What role will you or your office play in the administration's response to what's happening in Eastern Europe?
question is, what role will USTR play in the policy decisions that are made with respect to Eastern Europe? USTR is a member of the Cabinet. USTR is a member of the Economic Policy Council, and economic and trade, foreign policy issues are addressed in those fora. In addition, USTR is an invited member to the NSC policy reviews, and so we are fully apprised and cast our vote on policy issues involving Eastern Europe, just as we cast them on policy issues involving the full range of economic issues that affect trade and the future of our country. And we have, of course, been working with the President to try to develop a set of policies that will intend to encourage trade in Poland and Hungary, for example, providing GSP advantages, the General System of Preferences, which reduces and waives duties as to certain products, that provides most favored nation status, which was announced last week with respect to Hungary, and to try to work with the other departments and agencies in government to energize the process in Eastern Europe, which we obviously applaud. And I would say that we believe that working with the private sector and working with these trade benefits is a constructive way to proceed, and that we don't have much experience with having a nation that has been encumbered by communism for so long emerge, and that we do believe that it is far better to try to build up the muscle in the private sector and the energy there than to simply have large sums of money go government to government, particularly in the emergence from a state-run economy. We worry as to how those monies would be appropriately spent. So we're working very closely and carefully with interests in Poland and in this country and in Hungary and in this country to try to help that emergence take place and to continue to take place as we move ahead.
Ambassador Hills, thank you.
My great pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Hills, thank you for your insight, your time, and your eloquence. When it comes to matters of business and finance, perhaps no member of the United States Senate is more knowledgeable or experienced than Lloyd Bentsen of Texas. Lloyd Bentsen left the campus of the University of Texas as a young man. By the time he was 23 years old, he was leading an American fighter squadron into combat in World War II. He won his nation's decorations in gratitude for that. He came to the Congress as its youngest member, served 3 terms here after the war, decided not to seek re-election in 1954 because, as he put it, he wanted to do something more with my life. He went to the private sector where he had enjoyed great success as in the insurance industry and financial services company that he founded. In 1970, he won a seat in the United States Senate. In 1976, in 82, and 88, he was re-elected to the United States Senate by the people of Texas. Some people are described as the chairman of the powerful Senate Finance Committee. Lloyd Bentsen is more accurately described as the powerful chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. He won the nation's attention as the nominee of his party in 1988 for vice president. Ladies and gentlemen, the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee of the United States, Lloyd Bentsen of Texas.
Thank you very much. I apologize for being a bit late. That traffic gridlock I've been locked up in is very much like the United States Senate at the moment, because that's what we've been facing. I don't know how many of you saw a recent issue of Fortune magazine, but it showed this smiling executive leaning over a fax machine at a McDonald's hamburger place, and they'd faxed in his order. And then they talked about what kind of effect it was going to have on the American economy, the fax machine. But then they got to the real point. They said, you know, the fax machine was invented in this country, but it's no longer being manufactured here, it's being manufactured in Japan. Xerox invented it, but now they have a licensing agreement and a co-venture in Japan in order to effectuate it and bring it to the market. That's part of the problem that we've been running into in the United States. Most of us in this country learned about the genius of creativity in America and the things they invented. Way back there, the Eli Whitney and the cotton gin, and Henry Ford and his assembly line. And there were days when we made fortunes out of creating those things. But now, that creativity isn't dead, but the utilization of the technology is too often in other places. If we look at the color TV, with RCA inventing it, or we look at the VCR that's by that television set, or we look at the microwave oven, and time and time again, those things are being invented in other countries. Not invented in other countries, but the technology utilized in other countries. And that's a part of the deficit and trade problem that we're facing. At one time, we could say, well, the Japanese, their cost of labor is so much cheaper, or the West Germans is cheaper. But labor unit costs today in Japan and West Germany are equivalent of ours, and in some cases even more so. So what's happening to the United States? Part of the problem that we're running into is the cost of money in our country and the accumulation of capital and the problems that are derived from it. We're looking at a prime rate in this country of about 10.5%. We're looking at the West Germans at about 9%. We're looking at the Japanese at about 4.8%. I don't care how smart your management is, how hard your labor works. If you go out to build a new plant and the cost of capital for you, whether you're manufacturing widgets or something else, is over twice as much in this country as it is in one of your competitors' countries, such as Japan, you start out at an enormous disadvantage. And that's why we have to turn it around. I had you a prepared speech. I don't believe I'll use that. But I feel pretty strongly about this issue. That's why you have to get accumulation of capital up in our country and interest rates down. Now, how do you do it? One of the principal ways is to get this deficit down. But what have we seen thus far by the administration? We've seen some real creative accounting. If you don't want to have it in the budget, and you don't want to face Graham-Rudman, then advance the pay to the military by a couple of days and put it in last year's fiscal year so it doesn't apply now. If you got yourself a big bust in S&Ls, put 60% of it off budget. Spend another $2.8 billion because you don't have a direct obligation of the government and have to pay more interest rates, but take it off budget. If you have $500 million worth of food stamps that people have lost or have stuck away in drawers and never going to spend, then charge them off and say that's a savings. Now that's the problem that's taken place. And that's what I prophesied when we had our budget summit meeting between the administration and the Congress. So what you have seen is an administration that has not really made the tough choices and faced up to cutting this deficit. And you've seen a Congress that's gone along with it. So you've seen Republicans and Democrats both in that kind of a situation. Now we're in a gridlock in the Senate because we're talking about capital gains. And the administration putting that on and making that a priority for us. The priority ought to be to get this deficit down. That's the greatest savings you can have, and that's the best way that you can get interest rates down. And then the next one is to put back some of the incentives for savings that we've had in this country. We cut back on the IRA. And the argument was whether that really increased a net increase in savings. We sure found out. We cut back on the IRA and we saw savings go to the lowest point they'd been since 1947. We saw the Canadians going in tandem with us on savings until about the mid-70s. And then they increased the amount and they increased the base for savings. incentives for that. And you saw them move up to about 11% in plateau and maintain a differential with us ever since. And that's why I propose putting the IRA back in force and trying to satisfy some of the deepest concerns of the American people. For young people to try to buy that first home, getting tougher and tougher to do. More and more young couples living with their parents really want to be out on their own. And the parents thinking that's a pretty good idea too. So an IRA account that lets them save for that, and then the next tough one in this country is trying to save for the college education of your kids. More and more expensive to accomplish. So letting them pull those savings out tax-free to accomplish that, and of course for their own personal retirement. But if we can get the people in this country to save $10 more a week, we'll increase personal savings by 25%. So if you get the deficit down, and that's the number one saving, and you get personal savings up, we're a long ways toward trying to reduce some of our trade deficit and getting our interest rates down. If we can do that with the IRA, then you're going to see an increase in productivity along with that. And what we've seen for the last decade is our productivity lumbering along at about 1%. And we've seen the Germans and the Japanese 2 and 3 times that. One of the other problems we have is education of our peoples. Today we have 25 million people who can't read the label on a bottle of poison. 25% of them dropping out of high school. We have to pay our teachers more and demand more of them. Our kids study 30 minutes a night, homework. Japanese children are studying 2 hours a night. Our children go to school 180 days a year. Europeans are going to school over 200 days a year. And the Japanese are going to school about 220 days a year. And the South Koreans are going to school about 241 days a year. We have to have coordination and cooperation between business and the school system in trying to educate and train our people for those jobs and to increase their productivity. Because unless we have an educated workforce, we cannot be world competitive. And once again, that's one of the things that we should concentrate on. Now, I've been talking about the problems of this country of ours, and they are some tough ones. But you know, we've faced tough problems before. And what we must understand in this country is that the threat to this country today is not so much enemy tanks, not military aggression to the degree it's been in the past, but economic competition and from some of our best friends and allies. And people who after World War II, we went all out to try to see that they progressed and grew and prospered and were democratic. And we have succeeded beyond our wildest dreams with their vigor and their enterprise and what they've done also for themselves. And now we're seeing what I had always dreamed of and thought I'd fought for in World War II. We're seeing the decolonization of the Russian Empire and the decline of the Russian Empire, with the great opportunities available to us there. And what the Russian leaders are finding is that when you talk about reform, you can't leap slowly. A big part of that is because of what they've seen visually on TV, material things they want, and they want them now in their lifetime. And they know it's a different economic system that's been able to bring that one about. We're even hearing some stories about Germany and East Germany and West Germany and possible reunification. And that's of great concern to the Russians because you're talking about 20 million dead they remember, and the French and the English and what they remember. I was at a meeting at La Toja with the Bilderberg group the other day, and I heard one of the speakers say, "We love Germany so much that we want 2 of them." And I can understand that too. But these are the opportunities that are awaiting us. I was a businessman for 16 years building a business in the financial field. And one of the things I always like to look at was the balance sheet. So as I talk about these problems, let's also look at the other side. I know of no country in the world that has more resources than this one does, and still the #1 economy in the world. And we've faced challenges many times in our past. And now that you see the rays of democracy shining into Eastern Europe and into the Far East, and we look at the great strengths of this country and what's happening to the democratic process, then it's time that we work together amongst our nations to try to develop trade and prosperity for all of us and face up to these challenges. And I think we'll do that in this country. Thank you very much. Why don't I take some questions?
Sure. Would you just repeat the question so that...
All right. Now I'll take about 10 minutes of questions, and let's have a few ground rules. If you'd please stand up and seek recognition and speak in a loud, clear voice so I can hear you, and state your name, and no 6-part questions, please, because I can't remember the whole list, and no speeches, because I'm the only one that signed up to make a speech at this hour. All right, let's have it.
Right back here.
This crowd apparently has all the answers.
President Bush alibi to leave his stand on not raising taxes? Would that be a big fall in the dollar, or the foreign capital not longer flowing in, or a recession like maybe it's possible in 1990, or something like an October 87 crash?
I couldn't hear all of that. I really need a speaker, a microphone. Could you do that?
Thank you very much.
You're so eloquent, we ought to hear it twice.
Because that's the main problem, and it stays a problem for every year here. On taxes, what would make President Bush leaving his stand on not increasing taxes? What external or internal shocks would do that? Would it be a big fall in the dollar, or the foreign capital stopping streaming in the country? Or would it be something like the October 87 crash? Was already something like that? Yeah, to come.
All happy alternatives. Well, let me state, I hope we don't have any of them. I hope we come to our senses and do what has to be done on this deficit and really do the meaningful cuts that have to be made. Right now we have the question on capital gains, and that's what's blocking us. That's what's put us in gridlock. Now let me talk about capital gains a minute, because here we have a bunch of investment bankers, principally, and most of you have always been for a reduction in capital gains. Right? Right. All right. Now, and let me further state that I've been for a reduction in capital gains, and I fought hard to bring it down when it was 49.125 capital gains. When the personal income tax rate was 90% in this country, then 70%, and then 50%, and in 1986 we made a deal that if we would bring the personal income tax rate for the highest income people in the country down to 28%. One of the ways we would help pay for it was by bringing the capital gains rate up from 20 to 28%. The Reagan administration said if we bring that up, we'd pick up $22 billion over 5 years. $22 billion. And that helped pay for bringing the rate down on personal income tax rate. I don't know of any people of wealth who really thought they could ever dream that we would see the personal income tax rate in this country down at 28%. I don't know of any major nation in the world that has that low a personal income tax rate. Now, do you really think you can cut the capital gains rate substantially and not see a move on the other parts of it? The one that's proposed to us now, the Congressional Budget Office, which is nonpartisan, estimates that over 10 years will cost us $37 billion in revenue. $37 billion. Now that's when we have deficits and we're trying to cut down on the debt, or not increase it at least. You think that's not going to be made up some way by taxes? Of course it is. And the one that they proposed in the House, that was the most atrocious thing, and supported by the administration, that they'd cut it for 27 months. got from 28 to 19.6 for 27 months and then back up again. Now, how do you think people would react to that? They'd all say, well, during that 27 months, I'll wait till about 24 months to get the play on my money and the stocks I'm invested in, and then I'm going to hit that market and get out. Because the rate's going back up, and then I'll hold what I have left until the next windfall comes along. And then I hear people say, well, you really want to cut the capital gains rate because we want to encourage venture capital in the country. In 1987, venture capital that came from individuals was 12%. In 1988, it was 8%. Much of it came from funds that paid no taxes at all. Pension funds, that type of thing. So taxes didn't influence them. Now, how do you make a venture capital investment? Well, if you're going into venture capital and if you have any sophistication at all, you know that the vast majority of them fail. And that the lemons mature very early. You find those out pretty quick. And then maybe you have 2 or 3 that are comatose. And then maybe one succeeds, and that's the bell ringer. Now, why do you go into venture capital? Because you want to find an Apple computer. Because you want to hit a home run. And I really don't believe the fact that you're going to have, if you hit that home run, finally going to have your profits reduced by 8% is going to make that difference in your investment. 2 years, I'll tell you what that deal reminded me of. Baseball story in this country about a fellow who was pitching to Willie Mays. I'm not sure if you know who Willie Mays is, but he was one hell of a slugger. But he pitched to Willie Mays, and Willie Mays hit that baseball right out of the stadium, hit a home run. And the reporter came to the pitcher and he said, what happened? And the pitcher said, well, I'll tell you this. It was one hell of a pitch for the first 60 feet. You bet. Capital gains will bring money in for that first year or two. But then it begins to cost you. And that's the problem that we run into in that situation. You got one more question.
Right back here. Could you come to the
Yes.
microphone, please?
Please.
All right.
I'm not sure I can. There's a lot of noise back here. You really must come to the microphone.
Thank you. We've got some trucks back here.
Yeah.
A relatively simple way of helping solving one of the twin deficits would be to introduce a gasoline tax. As a Texan, would you comment on that?
Well, a gasoline tax, thanks a lot. Let me tell you, back in 73 and 74, I talk about me not talking about a gasoline tax. 73 and 74, when we had the long lines, the gas pump, and we had the embargo on by the Arab countries, I went into the Democratic Policy Committee and I said, we ought to put a 25-cent gasoline tax on them. Don't use ration stamps, use price. 25-cent gasoline tax. Come up with alternative fuels. Finance that with that money. And I can remember what one of the fellows, John Pastore, a senator from Rhode Island, said, former governor of Rhode Island. He said, not only no, but hell no, Lloyd. And I said, why? He said, when I was governor of Rhode Island, I passed a 1-cent gasoline tax, and they named the damn thing after me. And he said, I'll never do that again. But let me tell you from Texas, if you're talking about the oil industry, that's not a problem. We can sell every bit of oil we produce in this country, and you're not going to bring the price down by whatever conservation comes from that. What happens to us is that we have a great deal of rural communities too, and we're not all urbanized, and we don't have the mass transit that much of the rest of the country has. And therefore, we pay a disproportionate part of a gasoline tax. Now, if we can come up with ways to equate that and make it a fair distribution of that gasoline tax, I'd be very interested in it. Thank you very much. Good to see you.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Benson. That concludes our morning session. And next is lunch with Vice President Quayle. Thank you.
Tune in later today at 4:35